So thank you all so much for joining us today. As I said, my name is Liz Friend-Smith, and I look after our publishing in European history at Cambridge University Press. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing this event today, which is going to take the form of a conversation between Tim, Kristin, and Jeremy. Timothy Scott-Brown is Professor and Chair of History at Northeastern University and Senior Fellow at the Institute for European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His publications include Sixties Europe, West Germany and the Global Sixties, published by Cambridge in 2013, and Weimar Radicals, published by Berghahn in 2009. He is co-editor of The Global Sixties in Sound and Vision, published by Palgrave in 2014, and Between the Avant-Garde and the Everyday in 2011. His new project is entitled The Greening of Cold War Germany, Environmentalism and Social Movements Across the Wall and Beyond, 1968 to 1989. Kristin Ross taught for many years at the University of California, Santa Cruz and NYU. Among her books are May 68 and Its Afterlives and Communal Luxury, The Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune. Finally, Jeremy Varon is a professor of history at the New School in New York City. He is author of Bringing the War Home, The Weather Underground, The Red Army Faction, and Revolutionary Violence in the 60s and 70s. And she is co-founder and editor of The Sixties, a journal of history, politics, and culture. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this conversation about Tim's work. So without further ado, over to you, Tim, Jeremy, and Kristin. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining. We decided that I'd start off by just saying a few words about the book and how I conceived the book. And so I'll begin with that. The 60s Europe book grows out of the work I've been doing on Germany, primarily West Germany, but also East Germany over the last, decade or so. There were three main things I wanted to accomplish with the book. It's a study of the 60s, or the sort of radical movements of 1968 in broadly conceived in Europe. And one thing I wanted to do is sort of right across the East-West divide in a new way. I feel like the scholarship on Western Europe, or capitalist Europe, and the scholarship on state socialist Europe was kind of fractured. So I wanted to combine them and find a analytically worthwhile way of thinking about Europe as a whole. So one thing I've done in the book is sort of support this turn in the scholarship to take seriously, emancipatory understandings of the socialist project that were taking place within state socialist societies in the East Bloc. And here I argue that the 60s in the East are an attempt to find a way forward to socialism rather than an attempt to escape into liberal democracy and re-embrace capitalism. A second main thing I try to do in the book is to talk about the connection between politics and culture, which has been a big focus of my previous work and the work I've done in West Germany in particular. The Cultural Revolution in the 1960s was really inseparable from the political revolution, and so I wanted to think about how exactly those two things fit together, how culture informed politics and vice versa. And relevant here is the continued importance of a transnational approach that focuses on the movement of ideas and activists across borders. A third main thing I wanted to do in the book is to break out of this sort of 1968 as a turning point narrative. I try to situate the radicalism of the 1960s in the long sweep of revolutionary history. And to do that, I focus on a set of classical revolutionary dilemmas that preceded 1968 and that continued to remain later and even today. And I sort of deal with a set of antinomies in the book between authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism, between organization and spontaneity, between the individual and the collective. And I really try to focus on looking at 68 as a moment, one among many moments at which these issues come into play. And I focus here especially on the way in which activists looked back to previous revolutionary moments and previous revolutionary movements and sought source material with which to put together the revolution that they were trying to create. And the gold thread in the study is really the concept of worker self-management, which is linked to participatory democracy. And many commentators have noted the crucial role played by participatory democracy in the movements of the 1960s on both sides of the Atlantic. And I really wanted to focus on specifically on the concept and practice of worker self-management as something that obviously is of key importance in certain places in Western Europe, but is also extremely important in Eastern Europe, and is one of the factors that really makes it possible to talk about Eastern and Western Europe as part of a unitary event. I guess in this connection, in terms of thinking of 68 as a key moment in a great trajectory of key moments, in emphasizing Eastern Europe more than is sometimes done, I don't want to, ignore the critical importance of the third world by bringing in the second. Obviously I focus in the book on the way in which European 68s and the European 68 sit nested within the decolonization struggles and I in the third world or in the global south, and I trace the way that those struggles made their imprint on European struggles and the way that the source material of those revolutions were of key importance. But I also pay attention in the book to what is classically European in this 68, rather than focus almost exclusively, as sometimes done, on third world models like Mao, Che, Castro, and Ho Chi Minh. I focus on sort of some of the lost traditions that are really informed from Europe, that really inform what's going on both sides of the Cold War divide. So what emerges in the book is sort of a different history of 68 in Europe that traces a different intellectual lineage or set of lineages than the ones that usually get traced, without ignoring those, of course, because they are also of key importance. I feel that the book, I write the book very much from the perspective of the present. I feel that just in the same way that we can think about 68 as a continuation of revolutionary traditions that are dealing with perennial problems about the organization of human society, that we can see that those problems have yet to be resolved, and that they continue to resonate in the present and inform current struggles. One of the key ones in the book is the worry over false media, the worry that media is poisoning people's minds and making it impossible for them to be rational and to take rational steps to improve society. And I think that is very much obviously still in play. We're seeing the outcome of that critique this very moment, or the outcome of what critics diagnose, I should say. I focus heavily, as I mentioned earlier, on the use of history, the attempt to rediscover the past and past struggles. I think that's always part and parcel of revolutionary movements. Sometimes the past comes into view in a useful way. They're a usable, radical past, and sometimes the past is extremely opaque. We could talk about how opaque it is in different societies at present. And then, the question that informs the book, a third big question is the question of socialism, the question of what socialism is, what it means, how it could be constructed. I would say that question, which is linked, of course, to the question of capitalism, and I think that question is very much still here, and it's being sharpened now by the climate question. So rather than see the 60s as this insular moment in which a bunch of time-sensitive stuff happened that rock and roll and youth culture was important, and the third world struggle was important, and it gives rise to this unique concatenation of events. And all that's true, but instead of seeing it as just that, I see it as an entry and an ongoing conversation, an ongoing sub struggles, which makes it more meaningful and also makes it, I think, more historically explicable. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've tried to do in the book. And if we want to pass over to Jeremy and Kristin, that would be great.
I'm happy to start, Kristin, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, first off, congratulations, Tim. When I heard you were writing this book, I got very excited because I knew it would be rigorous, beautifully written, and at some level original. And let me start with the, originality. There's lots of multi-country studies of the 1960s, often taking 1968 as, the organizing point, and you're given, snapshots of rebellion in far-flung capitals in Europe and beyond. But what these studies often fail to do is provide anything like a coherent narrative. So the reader has to link in his or her mind what connects rebellions in disparate places. And then you've tried to write, a truly European story, again, with a kind of analytic coherence to it. And in your presentation, I think you highlighted what distinguishes the book, namely the sense that radicals on both sides of the Iron Curtain were each seeking socialism for different reasons. For the folks in the West, as an alternative to liberal democratic capitalism, implicated in racism, colonialism, and imperialism. And for those folks in the East, an alternative to sclerotic, heavily bureaucratized, authoritarian, state socialism. And then the protagonists of your story, situationists, were critical both of communism and capitalism, and just about all of the, again, key protagonists are searching for a kind of middle way. And then that raised some questions in my mind. I mean, first, I had never taken the efforts to reform socialism in the East all that seriously, right? I thought that the only language available to them for rebellion was some version of Marxism. So at least superficially, they wanted to enhance workers' rights and worker self-control, but really they were kind of sort of longing for the freedom of the West. And then I think you demonstrate how naive that view is by looking, whether it's Yugoslavia or Poland or Czechoslovakia, all of these concrete efforts to recover a humanistic socialist tradition. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Then, in the West, most radicals claimed affinity with some version of socialism, for obvious reasons. And yet there was so little by way of actual concrete efforts to reorganize production and consumption and the meaning and nature of work on socialist lines. So I wonder, was socialism in the West a kind of idealized alternative that not only didn't have much viability over time, but that people didn't even necessarily seriously pursue outside of a couple of epiphanous moments of worker self-control in May 68. So you're making socialism, in a sense, the focus of the book, but I don't know that 1968 ultimately advanced the socialist project if you look at the large historical sweep. So there's a lot there. Please respond.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the kind words, Jeremy, and for the questions. So yeah, as far as the East is concerned, I mean, I think the idea that I think you're right in the sense that socialism was the available language, and you're right also to note, and I would say agree with the argument in the book that it wasn't that they were longing for the freedom of the West. I mean, they longed for freedom, but they took socialism as a given, and they were committed to the project, and it's just writing back over history from a neoliberal perspective that allows us to think that actually they were just waiting for 1989 to happen so they could get the hand of Stalinism off their neck, right? In the West, the idea of socialism as an idealized alternative, I mean, you mentioned May 68 and of course the massive workers mobilizations in France. I mean, another example is Italy, right? Like there's massive mobilization of workers in Italy as well. I think the question of if it was attempted to realize socialism, kind of it goes to the heart of a key sort of feature of 68, which is that there's an attempt by different actors, students, people in the counterculture, workers, others, to try and realize a generalized feeling of revolt that's there on multiple levels. It's a revolt against the stifling character of daily life, cultural conformism, the commodification of desire, a revolt against untruth, especially in media or in government pronouncements, a revolt against state violence, especially the state violence exercised abroad in form of colonialism. And there's an attempt to find a way to find ways to codify this set of ideas and this spirit of revolt, right? And in order to do that, people look for source material, but the source material is extremely disparate. There's theory and practices drawn from sort of the European avant-garde, whether it's the Provos combining youth culture with anarchist flavored direct action. There's the situationist critique, the Frankfurt School critique. There's a revival of anarchism. There's all that's going on, and it's that coexist with attempts to rethink Marxism-Leninism and to sort of find a Leninist model that rejects Stalinism but nevertheless is liberatory. And these things all don't really fit together, right? Like this is a key feature of 68, that there's a bunch of sort of multiple revolutions going on that partake of this generalized feeling of rebellion and are attempts to find a way forward. And they all revolve around different understandings of the socialist project, and especially in many cases around sort of anarchist or council communist sort of understandings of the socialist project. But by their very nature, as cobbled together pieces of revolutionary ideas and revolutionary practices, especially those drawn from partially erased or fractured traditions from the past, it's extremely difficult, to find agreement about what the socialist project would actually look like, right? So, 68, it drives things forward in a certain way, but it doesn't produce the goods, as it were. And I think that that's partly because what the goods are is unclear, right? And yeah, I mean, I'll stop there.
Right, and then the only thing I'll add here is that it sort of demonstrates the resilience and recuperative powers of capitalism itself. I think it's not just that they couldn't agree on the alternative, but what they were up against was cunning, massive, and powerful.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true, and that's one of the reasons why the question of co-optation or recuperation, as they frequently called it, was so prominent. I mean, it's so strongly in the sources. People weren't worrying in real time about how the revolution is being packaged and sold back, right? And it's like this whole thing of like, what was the 60s revolution? What was the success, right? Is the success that we, in sort of like a Marwickian mode, that that we get mini skirts and Beatle boots and pop culture, or is it that we we end up with Apple computers, right? Like, there's the way in which the success is what gets sold back, right? But there's constant worry about that from the very beginning. And as you say, they recognized, and we recognized, that the recuperative powers of the system were extremely strong and resilient, and that was really like a difficult thing to fight against. Yeah, I'll stop for now, and then we can circle back as needed.
Well, I'd just like to join Jeremy in congratulating the ambition of this book, because so often, even within a single national tradition, like say of France, you have these anthologies about the 60s, and they tend to be kind of kaleidoscopic, and you have each expert coming in on some tiny aspect, music or fashion, or and it ends up with a kind of attempt to recreate the spirit of the times or something like that, and with absolutely no no argument, no synthetic level whatsoever. And here, I think what you've done is not even just at the level of the single nation, but you really have given us a picture of your titles, 60s Europe. And my interest is not so much in what happened in the 60s, but in what's available for us to see or to speak. What can we say about the 60s at any given moment? What can we see of it? What's perceptible? And what you've done in this book is by recentering, putting the East in a way in the center, I would say. You've really, at least for me, whole new vistas and experiences have come into focus, and for the first time in great detail. And I have a sense now of the lived reality of the anti-Stalinist left in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia. And I learned, for example, something I never knew: the centrality of the war in Vietnam for them. It never occurred to me that people on the East would be so focused on American imperialism in Vietnam. So, I wanted to run out and try to find, if I could find the album, The Plastic People of the Universe, and see if I could get a copy of it. Maybe you have it behind you somewhere in that stack of records. So I think
probably better to read about than to listen to. But
oh, really?
Possibly.
Well, no, but that for me, that is the major achievement of the book, is the way in which it so effectively dismantles one of the most sort of ubiquitous cliches about the 60s, which was popularized by Cold Warriors and professional anti-communists like Tony Judd, and that the cliche that the insurgents in the Eastern Bloc were trying to get their hands on, the consumer goods of the West, and that's what they wanted, and that's and that the Western people were just spoiled, and that they didn't recognize how fabulous capitalism was. So, as you say, it's a kind of telescoping or collapsing of 1989 into 1956 and 1968, and you've really cleared the terrain for us very effectively of that, very forcefully. And also I would add too that in the book, other areas of Europe come through very, very clearly for me, like Portugal, for example, and Greece and Italy. And this is, this is something that, again, I think is very new and very original and important about the book. Let's see. So now I want to ask you a question, though, about the the problem I have, and this would be to return to certain questions of national specificity, and to the whole your whole discussion of the counterculture and the flourishing of the counterculture, the as you put it, a semi-autonomous international youth culture with its own mores, preoccupations, and style. And I wondered whether or not that focus came out of the fact that, now see, I would say that that's certainly true for Holland, it's true for the UK, it's true for Germany, and I learned from you that it's true for the East as well. But I don't think it's really all that true for Italy or France or Spain. I think that there's a way in which the music scene, for example, even up through the 70s almost in France, was very national. I mean, it wasn't in the US or in England or in Germany, you could become politicized through the counterculture. Like you could sneak in through the back door, through drugs, through music, through what we could think of as youth culture. You could arrive at politics. But I'm not so sure that that was the case in places like France and Italy. I think that there the counterculture was the flourishing of the counterculture, which is much, much later, is a sign of the waning of political militancy that had been really in place in coming out of World War II. And so that's I felt that sometimes you didn't emphasize enough the unevenness of what you're calling youth culture. Even to the point, I mean, I was very happy to learn, for example, that you emphasize the peace movement and the intergenerational aspect of the peace movement coming into the 60s. And that interests me because I don't know, I think in the case of France, emphasizing something called youth culture is a kind of Americanization of the memory of French May. I would put it that way. I think the interesting things about the French 60s didn't necessarily have too much to do with youth. They happened in places like Nantes, something like what went on with farmers out in Nantes and the striking workers out there. So that whole history is, to me, much more powerful than a kind of international youth culture, as I say. So that's something I want to ask you about is would you say that, I mean, would you agree with me on that for what you're calling the counterculture, the vector is really the UK, the US, Germany, Holland, that whole, and maybe it's largely linguistic, I mean, I think the English-German connection is much stronger than when you get into the Romance languages and the, you know, the movement, cultural movement. What language is it taking place in? Is it just the, you know, is it just music?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Kristen. First of all, thanks for the praise for the book, which is very meaningful to me because your own work is so important and stimulating for me and has been for my thinking, and same goes to you, Jeremy. Um, as to the question of yeah, national specificity, I mean, clearly there are some differences in the way that these transnational flows fall on individual national terrains, right? Um, I mean, I think that, so first of all, I would say that I think that the counterculture, it it sort of like crescendos at different times in different settings. That's clearly true. It is in many places kind of more of like a early 70s phenomenon, and in France, I think you're correct that this is true, which I don't think um, discounts, you know, the way in which France took part in these flows already in the 60s. But the thing is that, you know, things in terms of the transnational flow of youth culture or cultural products in general, people tend to adopt what they need in their local settings. And I would argue that the French don't need that much because France is a seat of culture, a very self-assured seat of culture, and it's also a very self-assured seedbed of revolutionary struggle, right? And so, I mean, there's a reason why, you know, why the massive workers' strikes were so much a part of May '68 in France. Um, and so, you know, clearly there's a relationship between the political and the cultural that exist in different ratios in different places. I think you're spot on about that. I think I would dispute that it wasn't that the counterculture as such wasn't important in Italy. It seems that it was extremely important in Italy early on. And I mean, one of the sites of that is kind of the intergenerational thing you mentioned around beat culture, right? Because the idea, and I do talk about this at some length in the Italy section, you know, the idea of beat in terms of poetry and personal, you know, style and comportment is very important throughout Europe, and it's important in Italy specifically, and then like kind of articulates with or segues into kind of the adoption of hippie type stuff, right? But it's seen, I guess, so one thing that's going on here that I've thought about a lot in the past is the question of what the charge of things is in certain societies. Like when things are made an issue of, then they take on a greater charge, right? Like it's certainly a bigger deal for a man to have long hair in East Germany than in West Germany, for example, even though it's a big deal in West Germany too early on. But it's like the more that regimes make a claim on the behavior and appearance of youth, the more the revolutionary potential of these slight changes are. So that's another factor that kind of affects the valence of these different things in different societies. And some places are extremely precocious in terms of the counterculture. You mentioned, you know, the Netherlands, and you're certainly right about that. The UK, West Germany is extremely strongly represented here, and also, you know, the international counterculture is really important in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, to a lesser extent in Hungary. I mean, there's some places where there's only space. I mean, I think this applies in Hungary, where there's only more space for kind of like beat influenced philosophical apartment scene type thing, right? And then there's places where the countercultural occupation of space that we associate with the you know the classic locations of the counterculture in different countries is very important, which would be Prague, for example, right? And so yeah, but anyway, and then in a place like Spain that you mentioned, you know, the possibilities for that are circumscribed, right? So there needs to be attention, and I think pay attention to this part of it in the book. Understanding of the way in which, you know, I refer to three Europes, right? You know, the sort of liberal democratic capitalist, authoritarian capitalist, and state socialist Europes, and the valence of this stuff is different in the three of those, and then it's also variegated within the different countries. Quite right about that. It's also true that you know, it's interesting. I think you were referring to France when you talk about, you know, the counterculture as an artifact of waning political militancy. And there's an interesting relationship, and I think that's possibly true with France. Although it's interesting, some of the recent stuff about the groups practicing armed struggle in France in the 70s, they're extremely bound up with you know, with music, for example, and with you know, revolutionary understandings of Hendrix or even of the Clash and stuff like that, right? Like there's this kind of ground of political cultural militancy in France as well in the 70s that mirrors what's going on in West Germany with groups like the Blues, you know, who think of themselves as rock and roll rebels who are, you know, with a guitar in one hand and a Molotov cocktail in the other hand, you know. But you know, more broadly, there's a relationship between a differential relationship between the counterculture and political militancy, and that's one reason why we get in cultural memory, you know, the victory of the 60s being the counterculture, and the stupid part that we shouldn't have tried in the first place being the political militancy, right? I mean, that's the way it's often thought about and talked about.
Yeah.
But that was always disputed, you know, like in West Germany, especially which I wrote the previous book on, and so explored in quite a bit of detail. You know, across the left spectrum, there were very different ideas about how valuable cultural stuff was, you know, to the extent that in the Marxist-Leninist groups, they'd often be like, yeah, men shouldn't even have long hair. You know, that's detracting from our ability to link up with the workers, for example, right? Yeah, and then you know, I think I'm happy that you you know, the sort of polemic, you know, that's in the book, right, against Tony Judt and others. I really took issue with the sort of paternalistic liberal superiority that's embedded in some of these studies. And of course, I also take aim at the you know, we won after all argument, where winning means neoliberalism, and also erasure. I also sort of don't like the an over focus on the global South, like how cool it is. Isn't it cool that we embrace the global South? You know, sort of argument that ignores all the stuff that is really evergreen, right? In terms of like, how do you organize the workplace? Like, how do you actually overthrow capitalism? You know, when we're talking about that, right? So yeah, it's I'm glad the polemic was apparent, if not too explicit, but nevertheless apparent.
I'm just popping up again. We do have some questions coming in. So if I read the questions from the audience, then Tim and perhaps some of the other panelists will have an opportunity to comment. So the first question is, a large theme of the book is that activists on the left were concerned with recuperation in the post-68 period. Are there any ideas or strategies from the 1960s that have been so recuperated they're beyond repair? Many people argue that the counterculture has been incorporated into the mainstream and co-opted by neoliberalism to the point that it's irredeemable, for example.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess each generation has to find its cultural provocations, right? I mean, certain styles of cultural provocation no longer have any purchase, one might argue, right? Like, it's hard to see. I mean, there's certain genres of music, for example, that that still have radical charge, like certain parts of hip hop, for example, and maybe a scattered band here or there and other genres. But I mean, in general, you know, is rock music. Rock music can't be a generalized, can't be seen as a generalized revolutionary force the way it was in the mid 1960s. You know, with regard to the question of recuperation, it seems to me that what can't be recuperated is the question of who's got the money. You know what I mean? It's like the question of whether the workplace is democratic, the question of who's scraping the profits off the top of people's labor. That's an unrecuperable question, and that's still a really radical question. And the way to find out whether a question is radical is to probe that spot and see what kind of reaction there is, right? And another place that's unrecuperable is calling into question, you know, militarism, right, and imperialism, because that goes to the heart in some countries of national identity, right? So attacking at that spot is unrecuperable attack. And then in certain countries, attacking on the ground of race is an unrecuperable attack. All the places that provoke the most violent reaction are the places where recuperation is not possible. So, you know, I wasn't so interested in the 60s. I mean, I was interested in the 60s specifics, but in this conversation, you know, it's not the 60s specifics, but the 60s content and unresolved things. It's really important, I think.
I don't know if Jeremy or Kristin would like to comment on that.
No, I'm bad on recuperation. It's not.
I'd love to jump in. I mean, I think that, you know, your answer in the question does point to a kind of irony, which is that you might want to pose the serious militant political work that's revolutionary or sort of proto-revolutionary against the countercultural stuff, which you might see as more recuperable and potentially superficial. But it was often in the space of the counterculture that people devised experiments in transformed living and the production and distribution of goods in the forms of communes and co-ops and squats and collectives. And you can look back at that and say, oh, it's just a version of hip capitalism that doesn't fundamentally challenge neoliberal structures and so forth. And yet out of the counterculture did come meaningful endeavors for people to have transformed lives and transformed subjectivities and transformed consciousness and to live among one another a little more humanely and humanistically. So I don't, you know, I wouldn't write the counterculture off, say that it's all simply recuperation measured against the standard of something like socialist revolution that overthrows, you know, neoliberal capitalism. But then this becomes the great dilemma of judgment when you look at the legacy of the 60s. Did we win? Did we lose? Did we win by losing? Did we lose by winning? And to some extent, these are insoluble questions. And then just a little bit to repose my initial concern, like the aftermath of the 60s was the ramping up of neoliberalism. 1989 didn't end with the reconstruction of the socialist tradition in the former Eastern Bloc. The West didn't even move towards social democracy, let alone socialism. So I wonder how powerful the legacy of a reconstructed socialist project ultimately was historically. I mean, clearly you feel some affinity with it, which is wonderful. But I do wonder if it's recoverable.
I think this leads quite neatly onto another question that we've had on the significance of the fall of the Wall of Berlin. So the question is, what was the significance of the fall of the Wall of Berlin and the disappointment among Western 68ers with the discovery of reality in Eastern Germany being far short of the imagined ideal?
Well, you know, not that people in the West German left thought that East Germany was an imagined ideal. I mean, there, like as previously discussed, there are many different strands in the West German left, and of course, Rudi Dutschke, one of the most important early figures in the student movement in West Germany, was from East Germany, as were some of his comrades, and they knew well what was going on in the East. I mean, there were people in the West German left who had a better evaluation of East Germany, but I don't think that, and so some of them could have been shocked and were shocked, but I don't think that coming to grips with I think the reality of East Germany was already known.
So we don't have any more questions from the audience at the moment, but I'm sure that Kristin and Jeremy would like to probe you a little further, Tim. And the other thing I wanted to do, just because I missed the opportunity earlier, was just to draw attention to the book which we are celebrating today, and just to have that physical icon there as recorded in this session. So please do, everyone in the audience, please do send your questions for any of the panelists.
I can also try to speak to Jeremy's last reiterated question while we're waiting for other questions to come in. So, Jeremy, the question sort of is the socialist project recoverable as it was understood in the 60s? I mean, that was kind of my sense of your question.
Some version of that, or how much did the 60s advance the possibility of that recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of I think that question is embedded in the development of human society writ large. I mean, did the 60s, if we see the 60s as part of a continuum, it doesn't have to bear the weight of having figured out the question. I mean, I think, I would say that if we look at Eastern and Western Europe as a whole, it's possible to say, well, let's just look at the 20th century. I mean, I think the left went down some wrong paths, right? Like, on the one hand, the Bolsheviks win in Russia. They institute a kind of socialism that many 60s radicals, I would say the preponderance of 60s radicals, did not agree with or may have admired in certain ways, but it was not the gold standard of what a socialist revolution should be. They instituted, a form of state capitalism. I mean, there are various analyses of this, but basically the Bolshevik model gets imported and imposed over the entire socialist movement and turns into Stalinism and creates a situation in which you're either with us or against us. And it wasn't the thing to be with. Then you can simultaneously you can understand why people in the Cold War setting didn't want to reject necessarily. People on the left did not necessarily want to reject, the Russian experiment, but many people were rejecting it in the 60s from the left perspective, right? So this is like Pied Piper number one, and then Pied Piper number two in the European 60s is the idea that we need to, adopt the third world guerrilla struggle and put it to work in the West. And this doesn't have great results either, right? Even though, of course, you can understand why people admired countries and peoples who were fighting against U.S. imperialism and, and winning, like the Vietnamese, right? But it's like I quote people in the book who, from the left perspective, ask the question of whether, for example, Ho Chi Minh is a good model for the social struggle in the West, right? So there's this way in which, the enemy of the enemy is our friend. There's a way in which we have to back the people who are fighting, fighting capitalism, even if we don't fully agree with them. So these are sort of, lacunae in the radical vision of the 60s in a way, or places that it made it impossible to to fully commit to unfolding a workable socialist model in the societies themselves, the societies in question, right? So like I feel like working toward this project in certain historical settings is not the same thing as having answers to how this project's to be worked toward. And I think that, you know, in Eastern Europe, the reason Eastern Europe's so important is in the book is because these are the people who are stuck with the consequences of going down the wrong path with trying to do socialism the wrong way, and they're trying to dig their way out of that and say, like, we believe in socialism, but we don't believe in socialism as imposed by Stalinist secret police. How can we do it differently? And then that whole thing gets washed away and subsumed and turned into something that never existed, right, after 1989. But, you know, I think it's important to recover that because, you know, going back to the earlier point, that's not a recuperated struggle. It's just an erased struggle.
You know, one of the things that interested me a great deal in your attempt to write across that divide of East and West is towards the end of the book when you're talking about the meeting up of students and workers in Czechoslovakia and especially. And then, of course, that also being the case very much in France and Italy, especially in the West. And for me, that is one of the I don't know what to call it. I mean, I never think in terms of lessons. I don't think that the past gives us any lessons, but it is that attempt of a kind of, or the creation of what I would call a sort of relational political subjectivity that's formed out of that meeting of students and workers, or in the case that I mentioned earlier about Nantes in France, this relationship of a kind of solidarity that's formed between farmers, striking workers, and students. So it was a three-way thing in Nantes. And you know, to get back to what Jeremy was saying, it's a sort of instantiation of the commune form. You know, a commune which is a broader social sphere than just workers or just students, or, you know, so something like that for me is what 60s politics was about, was that kind of attempt, even if it's only at the level of an aspiration. It's a kind of a desire. It's not really identitarian at all. It's about a new kind of solidarity that's formed out of these attempts to work together or to create what you call these scenes, and I liked that very much, the notion of the scene in your book, these sort of loose aggregations of very different kinds of people that came together and that were used to that in normal kind of, say, capitalist life on the one hand, or, you know, Soviet bloc life on the other. These people were kept very far apart. You know, you didn't really, if you were a student, you really didn't encounter workers in your daily life unless you made these forms of efforts and forms of organization. And to see that going on both sides of the East and the West in your book, that I found that very, very kind of moving and politically interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Kristin. I like very much that way of looking at it that you're talking about of the commune form, and the way in which, you know, the sort of taken down the veil of daily life normalcy to reveal the possibility of solidarities across these groups. I think that's critically important, and that's part of what's definitely going on in the 60s that I think, as you suggest, even without giving lessons, that is part of the content that moves forward, right? And
Yeah, I think that's the content that moves forward the most. And what that has to do with socialism, it is a form of socialism, but it's not socialism at a kind of supra-governmental or way. You know, it's more the socialism of daily life, or some forming these kinds of alternative ways of living. Which, I mean, and Jeremy is right, that is a dimension of the counterculture, certainly.
Yeah, it's a place. Sorry, Liz, go ahead.
Sorry, Tim. I was just going to say we have time for one more question. We've got another question from the audience. So if I just pose this as the last question, the question is, what are the analytical benefits of talking about the left as a whole, even today? Can we talk about differences between left and right since the modern age, or do we always have to be specific about the period? Part of the reason I ask is because I think I clearly know what the left means since I belong to it, but it's hard to summarize in a few sentences. And you just have a couple of minutes to respond.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that certainly historically we could talk about lefts plural, right? But I think a part of what I'm trying to do in this book is show how the left is multifaceted, right? The left is a conversation or a set of struggles about the right way forward, and you really see that in the Cold War setting, because the left is stuck in this weird place where it's got a whole set of countries, a whole bloc claiming to be left and claiming to have ownership over what it means to be left, and having to like eke out spaces within that monolithic setting to say that the left is something different than what Soviet communism says it is, for example, right? Or what the right says it is, which is like being a lapdog for Stalin or whatever, right? For Stalinism. So it's possible to speak broadly of the left in daily speech, but I mean, of course, the content of what the left is part of what the whole thing of having a left is. It's part of what being on the left is figuring out what the proper content is. We can speak of left and right, of course. I mean, it's an extremely important conversation, when the right is so resurgent, and it's really important to keep clear about those lines of demarcation now more than ever, I would say. And there's, I don't really have time, I guess, in a way to go into all the ways we might think about that question, but I think the left and right categories are extremely important in a moment of insurgent fascism, when fascism tries to take over the mantle of being the group that is in opposition to power, right? Even though fascism always historically claims the mantle of the rebel or the revolutionary just only to reinforce the worst type of power, right? But there's still a moment in the space of social discussion in which the right can temporarily assume the mantle of the insurgent force, and it's more important than ever right now for the left to be the insurgent force and recognize what insurgency means, right?
I think that's a really good moment to finish. So I want to thank you all, especially Tim, for providing an occasion for such a fascinating conversation. This has been a really lovely event, so thank you very much. And thank you also to Kristin and Jeremy for helping to tease out so eloquently what is significant and important about this work. So thank you all, and thank you for all of your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to get to yours, but thank you all for coming to this event. Thank you, Tim, Kristin, and Jeremy, and I wish you all very well with the rest of your days. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Jeremy and Kristin.